Yeah, because my latest work in terms of communicating science has been about the voice. I thought that's what I'd talk about today. So I'm going to look at voices from the past, the present, and the future. And the book I wrote, called Now You're Talking, it's called that because it's kind of had features of places where speech emerges. And I guess the first thing, I mean, Tim alluded to when speech emerged in humans, or when humans got skin, I think was actually an illusion. But one of the great debates at the moment is, when did speech evolve? When did we get this ability, this great ability that I'm using here to communicate? And when I write about it and think about it, I think about, did we talk to this guy? So this is a reconstruction of a Neanderthal. So were we having conversations with these guys? More and more the evidence seems to be that that's probably likely to be the case. So it's a fascinating field. If you've never looked at the evolution of language, it's really worth reading about. Because you can't imagine that scientists can somehow peer through the past from evolutionary history to work out what's coming, what was in the past. I mean, after all, think of it, speech just disappears. Where is the archaeological evidence? The reason I think it's probably quite likely we talk to these guys is we know their vocal anatomy was certainly good enough to do it. We know that their hearing was certainly good enough to do it. And the question really comes down to, did they have the intelligence? I mean, it's generally thought the reason chimps don't speak, I mean, chimps are where we branched off from other primates about 7 million years ago. Chimps don't speak because they haven't got the neurological ability to control the very complex vocal anatomy. And so it's thought to be all about big brains. Now, we certainly know that Neanderthal brain was, well, slightly bigger than ours, actually, because they were slightly bigger. Were they intelligent? Well, it's really interesting. When I wrote the book a couple of years ago, when I was in the middle of writing it, one of the arguments for them not being intelligent was they didn't really have any symbolic behaviour. Now, symbolic behaviour seems being important because it implies higher level thoughts than just how to survive. And a good example of that would be ritual burials, or would be using things like cave art or cave paintings, or art very much in inverted commas. And as I was writing this 2 years ago, the oldest cave art was known, was thought very suddenly to be Homo sapien, modern man. But now it's thought to be Neanderthal. They found stuff which is 65,000 years ago in an area where they think that only Neanderthals are around. So it seems that they did have symbolic thought, which kind of makes you think that maybe they did have language, because they seem to have the intelligence to embark on such behaviour. And I'll give you another thing, just another factors to think about as you contemplate whether they could talk or not. Looking around here, I guess that most people in this room have Neanderthal DNA. Unless you come from sub-Saharan Africa, and that's where your relatives are from, you have 2 to 4% of Neanderthal DNA in your body. So we were breeding with these people. In fact, the more bits of DNA they get from ancient hominins, the more we realise we were breeding with each other quite freely. So sex can be non-consensual, so it doesn't have to be consensual. But it kind of seems a bit odd that we would breed quite so often if there wasn't some sort of communication going on. So I find looking back at the sort of history and old ancient acoustics really interesting. And just an aside from the voice, I thought I'd kind of show you this. So this is a model of Stonehenge that I have just finished building in our semi-anechoic chamber. I know there's people in ultrasound here. I do ultrasound a bit odd compared to what Tim does. I do ultrasound because when we measure in ancient structures or rooms, it's very difficult to build them full scale, but you can build them at model scale. And if you scale this is 1 to 12 scale, then you have to go to 12 times the frequency to do the testing. So that's the reason I get into the ultrasound region when I'm doing the work. So this is a 1 to 12 scale model of Stonehenge. Now you might say, why don't you go down to the site in Wiltshire? Well, the problem with the site in Wiltshire, there's about 100 stones in there. Most of them are lying flat on the floor. Most of them are not in the right place. So you go and test the acoustics there, you won't get what the sound was like in the past. If I test it there, this is what they think 2200 BC Stonehenge was roughly like. I can actually have all the stones in the places they're likely to be, using the best archaeological evidence, and actually test what the sound would be like. What we find is quite good for communication. It's quite good for sort of talking about, because the stones reflect the sound. You get rather more reverberation, rather more room effect than you would imagine from a space so small. So that's kind of sounds of the past. And I want to sort of kind of now look at, I'm going to end the talk by talking about sounds of the future, but I want to talk about sounds of the present, and I thought I'd talk about the most important linguistic situation I can think of. How do people pronounce scone or scone? Who says scone? Who says scone? Who thinks the person who said it a different way is completely and utterly wrong? It's interesting, isn't it? Sounds seen as being really important for kind of how we feel about it. If you want, here's a scone map of Britain. You may see it went on QI, this map. So one of the great things about doing popular science stuff is you get to interview some great people. So Adrian Lehman's at Lancaster University, who's the actual author of this research. And he has this app which allows you to find out the prevalence of pronunciations. So if you're actually in the red area, so up in Scotland, that means most of the population are pronouncing scone. Where if you're in the teal area, then most people are saying scone because it rhymes with stone. We have much discussion about Brexit and the Irish border, but no one talks about the scone border that exists in Ireland, I noticed, in all these deliberations. If you're in a yellow area, I'm trying to see where Loughborough is. Where's Loughborough? If you're in a yellow area, it's a mixture, sort of 50-50. Where are you roughly? Roughly around here?
Yeah.
Somewhere around here. So you're in a mixed area, maybe a slightly more scone than scone sort of kind of area. I think it's really interesting that we see pronunciation as being really important. If you do a BBC documentary, if you want to get complaints, mispronounce a word, I can tell you that will get many more answers than anything else you get complaints than anything else you can possibly do. And what we find is when people pronounce differently, we assume they're from a different group. And in Britain, when we hear someone talking in a different group, we often assume it's a different class, or should I say class? my come home in Manchester. So interesting enough, what is the class divide between scone and scone? Well, here's some YouGov data for you. This is my, it's not quite a pie chart, it's a scone chart, but it's all this one. So this is pronouncing it as scone, this is pronouncing it scone. Broadly speaking, ABC1 is upper class, very broadly, so blue bars are that. Orange bars are broadly working class. I know as a social scientist here, it's a broad brush definition. And can you see there isn't really a definite, rich people say scone, and working class people say scone. It's roughly split evenly. It's really interesting, we use this heuristic to identify groups, but it's a terrible heuristic. You should ignore it from forevermore. Because voice is about identity, and that's one of the things that makes it really fascinating. But a lot of the identity we take from voice, we have misconceptions about. We'll talk about a few more of those a bit later on. One important thing that I've already alluded to when we talk about accents is our group identity. And here's the important one in Britain, and that's the differentiation between whether you say last or last. So you might notice I say last, because I come from the south-west originally, I now live in Manchester, and my sons say last and complain forevermore whenever I say, let's have it's time to have a bath, because I don't think it's pronounced correctly. What's interesting about accents is they're generally changing in Britain. They're generally merging and becoming more southeastern. And this is a map showing you some changes. I should probably skip on to the map in a moment to show you some of those changes. But this case is 1950s on the left and 2016 on the right. Apologies for anyone who's outside England. The data from the 50s is only in England, so that's the reason it's only there. But can you see how the north-south divide kind of remains? You have the last in yellow and the last in green, and it kind of roughly stays the same in England as we go into 2016. So this is an important marker. So accents is about identity. And if it's an important part of our identity, then these accents don't change. But we'll see later on where things do change, because your vocal anatomy is really flexible. Things can change very rapidly and very quickly if you want them to. And it really matters, because people have really strong opinions of people with accents. Here's a book called Weird Things Customers Say in Bookshops. So this is someone buying a book from a bookseller and discussing whether to have a bag at the end of it. Bookseller, would you like a bag? We've got plastic or paper ones. Customer, well, I would have asked for a bag, but you said plastic bag, not plastic bag, so now you said that, I don't want one. Bookseller, I'm not sure people say plastic bag. Also, I'm from Newcastle, so they say bath. Bath even, not bath. Clearly, you're uneducated. So an example of why voice matters. We used to visual identity, aren't we? How we dress and the image we project, but our voice projects an image as well. In this case, someone is assuming if they've got a strong regional accent, they're uneducated. Now, it's certainly true that the more educated, the more you've probably travelled around, probably the less strong your accent is. But to assume any one person with a strong accent is uneducated is frankly racist. But yet we do this all the time. We kind of make these sort of kind of snap judgments, which are very unfair. As I said, what's generally happening in Britain is we're generally getting a sort of merging to an accent, in England, sorry, emerging to accents that are kind of unified. So this is rhoticity, and it's about when you pronounce your R's. So red is if you pronounce R's, it's something like arm, and green or teal is when you sort of tend to say and drop the R in the middle. And you see the 1950s, just looking in England, to the 2016, we've gone from a very clear split from sort of southwest to northeast very crudely to something that is much more even. So our voice is constantly under flux, and has been ever since we had a voice when we were maybe mating with Neanderthals. Some things maintain though, things which are important to identity. So I was up in Scotland doing this talk, and someone said, will the Scottish accent disappear then? I was saying, well, it seems pretty unlikely, because the identity of being a Scot is really important. So it's highly likely the Scottish accent will maintain, as it has done, because why would you want to lose that identity? So we're going to go and look on to kind of sort of a bit more about kind of how the voice works, because I want to sort of kind of take apart the voice and look at its flexibility. So we're going to do a really simple kind of vocal. We're just going to do ah, sort of kind of a vowel sound. If you put your hand on there and sing ah, what do you feel? You feel vibration. So those are the vocal folds or vocal cords moving. Then it's renamed the vocal folds, but everyone calls them vocal cords. It's very confusing. They're the same thing. So if you look into your throat, we'll show some images, not quite as unpleasant as Tim's images. We'll see these things in operation, and they move like this. They move in this kind of sort of motion. What if you put your hand on there and go sss at me? I always like to get audience hissing at me. It's always very nice. What can you feel? Nothing. So that's being generated by some form of constriction and turbulence right at the front of the mouth. So there's other ways of making sound, and we'll see a beatboxer in a moment doing sounds in different ways, but we're going to concentrate for a moment on this very simple sort of vowel sound. So that's where the voice is generated down here if you're doing a vowel sound with the vocal folds. What would it sound like on its own? So if you imagine chopping my head off at the moment that I'm kind of speaking, what would I sound like? Now here's a recording from Sophie, I nipped from Sophie Scott at UCL. So you can hear a sort of kind of buzzing sound. Does anyone recognise the nursery rhyme? Jack and Jill. So that's the start of the voice, is kind of this buzz that you generate, and this is where the pitch of the voice comes from. And then it's shaped by what happens above that. But let's first of all, we've seen an animation there. Let's actually look at some yucky videos, for those who don't like medical videos, of actually in action. So I've got to get a camera into that position to see the vocal folds. Anyone had this done medically? I've had it done at some point, yeah. Did you have the pleasant way or the unpleasant way? Through the mouth or up the nose?
Mouth.
Mouth. Nose. That's lovely, isn't it? We'll see that in a moment. But you can get into the mouth, but you can also go to the nasal cavity. So let's first of all watch it being done for the mouth. What you need to look for, so this is looking down on that on the vocal folds, and this is the view you get. So this is on the right hand side when you're just breathing normally. So we might think of vocal folds as their ability to create speech, and those are the white things there. But actually, first and foremost, they were, from an evolutionary point of view, they were created to stop rubbish getting in our lungs and us choking to death. So that's what they're really there to start with. And then later we sort of kind of co-opt them to make noises. So the right hand side is the breathing position, where we have them nice and wide and air can easily go into the lungs. And the left-hand side is when we pull them close together, those white pearly sort of curtains will open and close and create the sound we want. So that's what you're kind of looking for. And I've chosen a video off the YouTube. It's really good to look this one up, Tom Thumb. He's got some great videos on vocal technique. He does this live on stage. It's really, really good stuff. I would recommend looking him up. So we're going to see in beatbox, well, in this case, he's just going to sing some notes to start with, and we'll just see the process. So it's well worth looking the whole video up, because it gets more interesting than that as well. So basically, this is where the pitch notes. If I was talking a falsetto voice, I'm stretching out my vocal folds. Only the edge of the vocal folds are moving. I get a lighter thing moving, and therefore it goes up in frequency. So I can determine pitch from here. I can talk in a very boring monotone, a bit like an Andy Murray kind of thing, where my pitch and my voice doesn't vary. We vary it because it shades emotion to us, and we use it in things like motherese, where we're talking to babies to kind of help them learn about emotion in the voice, the paralinguistic aspects. And then once we've got that buzz from the vocal folds, we then shape it with what's called the vocal tract. So this is a picture of an MRI video. You're playing, this is an opera singer, vocal folds are down here somewhere, and then, I suppose I've got a pointer on this, and then there's the rest of it, so we're playing ball. And then what we're interested in is actually the pipe work. So it's like a beer bottle you go across, you've got resonances of the pipe work in your vocal tract, which is the top of the throat, the mouth, and the lips. One thing to note is the tongue is huge and very, very mobile. You're probably not aware of that unless you've looked at these videos before. So we just watch to see how we're manipulating those pipe work to create the different sounds in this singing. So it's quite amazing how much ability we have. And you might be thinking, well, Trevor, you've picked a video of an opera singer. Of course, they're highly skilled performers, and you know, I can't do this. You can do this just as well for speech, and it'll be just as amazing to watch your own speech going on. And if you think about it, if anyone's lived through a child that's learned to speak, you know, at say age 1, that child starts to make some words, and you know, only the parents have a clue what that baby is saying. It's really indistinct. It actually takes quite a few years before strangers can really consistently understand an infant talking. And that's because they're learning the delicate neurological control of the 100 or so muscles that are required in breathing and in the larynx and other areas to actually enable you to manipulate your mouth in this way and create the speech. So actually we're all just as skilled, we just may not be skilled opera singers when we're actually kind of creating sound. Now, I just want to play you the other part of this video where we go up the nose. And the reason we play it is because he beatboxes and it's just amazing just to watch. When you first does the video, the camera is stuck in the nasal passage for a bit, so you're not seeing the vocal folds. It's only the second half of the video the camera's pointing further on, and then you'll see the vocal folds. They'll be a bit smaller than before because of the camera use. Quite an amazing skill, and quite amazing to do it with the camera up your nose. He does it live on stage as well. If you're interested in beatboxing, the way they make sounds is fascinating. I mean, the kind of techniques they use, I've done whole shows on it, but the best people to look up are USC, who've got an amazing project with loads of MRI imaging on it, and sure, if you look up the beatboxing science and MRI, you would find them fairly straightforward. So I said the book was called Now You're Talking because it kind of talks about epochs of speaking. One of the most important epochs is when technology comes about and changes the voice. So we talk about the voice being always changing, and that's because it's really flexible. If you look at the vocal anatomy, there's no, you know, the skeleton's not really much involved. There is one bone, I guess the tongue, but mostly it's just got kind of loose stuff, or you know, loose stuff, maybe not be, but anyway, soft tissue hung from the skull. So you've got real flexibility to change your voice, which is the reason you can talk in different accents and all this kind of stuff. And that change that happens naturally gets accelerated by technology. I've picked a picture here of Edison because this is the point at which we can record voices and play back voices. I can go online to YouTube and type Alfred Lord Tennyson, Charge of the Light Brigade, and listen to the poet reading it back to me. I mean, it's quite amazing to think that at that point I can hear a poet who is obviously long dead. Before Edison's machine, we couldn't do that. If you want to hear someone talk, you would have to turn up and listen to them live. Now you can listen to people after they're spoken, even when they're dead, and you can also start doing things like talking to mass people because you can spread phonographs around. And that really changes the voice because it gives us ability to talk in a different way when we're mass communicating. I'm projecting my voice at you because I'm not using a microphone. As soon as you don't have a microphone, you can start talking in a very different way and you can start creating very different speaking styles. And there's an argument to be said that the very diverse singing voices that we have nowadays in pop music is really only possible because of microphones. And I'm just going to give you an example, it's a very old example, it's from the 1990s, just comparing two styles. And I'm going to pretend that Freddie Mercury, a rock frontman, is going to be singing in a with microphone style. And I'm going to say that Montserrat Caballé, as an opera singer, is singing with a style which predates the microphone. I mean, actually, opera style has changed a bit, but let's just take that as a broad brush approach. And I want you just to listen to the two differences in this duet called Barcelona from the 1990s. And you can listen to lots of differences between their voice, but one of the interesting differences to me is the lyric in terms of how intelligible the words are. Freddie Mercury, it's very clear what he's saying. Montserrat Caballé, I challenge you to recognise the language in places. So you can hear incredible differences in kind of the way they're singing. And you can relate that back to the physics problem of Montserrat Caballé standing at the front of the theatre and trying to hit an audience of 1,500 people without amplification. It limits what her vocal anatomy can do. Because if she talks in a sort of normal voice, she won't be powerful enough at the back. And therefore opera singers favour the melody line, and the purity of their voice and power, because they need it to reach the back of large auditoria. Whereas Freddie Mercury just needs to be good enough to this microphone, so he can whisper, he can shout, he can do all sorts of things that Montserrat Caballé could never do because they would sound pathetic at the back of the auditorium. And that's one of the things that microphones do, is they change the voice. And I can give you many other examples, but I wanted to talk a little bit about an experiment which, I'm going to skip past that because I'm conscious of time, which is really interesting, which I'm just about to run with the BBC. So there's a book here which I've got from the 1930s called Voice and Personality by Thomas Hartley Pear. And this is what he writes. It's actually written on the front page here. 10 years ago, the art of listening of speech barely existed. So he's talking about suddenly the use of microphones and mass broadcast on radio. Eyes were glutted while ears were starved. Print reached millions by their firesides. The voice a few score on hard benches in a gloomy hall. Broadcasting has changed all that. Because suddenly, with broadcasting, we can have one person talking to millions. That wasn't possible before. And he was fascinated by what personality people got from listening to radio voices. Because once you get radio, you get this really interesting situation where you listen to people, but you don't see them. So as I walked up to talk, you immediately started to take some sort of check on who I was by how I'm dressed, my age, my hairstyle, my ethnic group, my gender, all these things you've visually got. Then you hear my vocal identity. When you're on radio, you get the vocal identity first, and then all the other stuff comes about. So Pear's run an experiment back in the 1930s. It's the first mass psychology experiment where he got 9 people reading out Pickwick papers on the radio. Here's a bit from the book. These are the 9 people. People didn't see the pictures when they were doing the experiment. Amazingly, 4,000 people took part in this experiment in the 1930s. They filled this questionnaire in on the Radio Times and mailed it off to the BBC to analyse. What's really funny about it is people were spectacularly rude about these people in a way you can't quite imagine. So here's a description of some poor fellow. It's the detective sergeant, top left they're talking about, the guy with the pipe. He gave himself away by unconsciously using his evidently habitual scolding, hectoring voice with nasty twang. I don't mean accent, I mean viciousness. There was nothing in the passage at all calling for that feeling. He, I'm sure, is given to ranting and stirring up strife, a most bullying, unpleasant person. I don't think any of the 9 really quite knew what they signed up for. There's no comment in the book. But all these textual responses are at the back of this book. And you can actually, I've done an analysis of them. They're actually listed in the appendices. It's really interesting. And we're going to recreate this for the BBC. We're going to do a programme about the experiment past. We're creating the artificial voices. So we're going to create a whole set of Siri-like voices, Alexa-like voices, and look at people's reactions to those. It's being actually coded up by BBC Research and Development at the moment. It'll be going live in about a month. When you analyse the original experiment, this is the people, I don't know if you've ever looked at deadly grounds, but the people on the right, and this is how they split into groups. So the first splitting is between male and female. Then the male split between nervous and actor. Paul got these people reading on national radio with no rehearsal. So unsurprisingly, nervousness was one of the characteristics of quite a lot of people reading this passage. But the male-female split is what I wanted to talk about here. If you want more of this, I've got a paper on this kind of this splitting up and textual analysis. Because male-female split is one of those really important things that we get from the voice. The pitch of the voice is all about signalling your sexual dimorphism, the difference between females and males. And so that's a really dominant behaviour in how people respond to voice. To contextualise this, I got this online when I was just coming down the train from Mumsnet about Joe Swinson, the Liberal Democrat leader. I do find her voice very shrill and therefore off-putting. It gets more shrill as she becomes more indignant, and it sounds less authoritative than calmer, deeper voices of either gender. There's a really interesting thing going on with female voices, that if they want to sound authoritative, they need to lower their voice and sound more male. And Mary Beard writes well about this if you want to read in her book. Here's a quote from Mary Beard about this problem. When as listeners we hear a female voice, we don't hear a voice that connotes authority, or rather we haven't learnt how to hear authority in it. So when you hear the inevitable stories about Jo Swinson's voice, bear in mind that it's all based on prejudice. It's got nothing to do with how she talks. She should be able to talk in her natural pitch, and she should sound authoritative. It's just we're used to leaders being men, and we're used to leaders therefore having lower voices. So it's really interesting with the gender and the stereotypical attitudes towards voice. And one thing you see, this has been quite well written about, with someone mentioning over lunch, I can't remember, the fact that Siri tends to be a female voice and all that. There's issues around gender bias and voice everywhere. Here's another example, using Kim Kardashian, who I'm sure you all know in the room and have great fans of. Whenever females innovate in a voice, they tend to get criticised for it. There's particularly young women speaking styles that people write very vehemently about and protest when they appear on the radio. This one's called vocal fry, which is about how you use your vocal folds. Now, you may not know what vocal fry is, but this short video, you'll certainly know by the end of it. There we go, see, just the whole prejudice that's come out. Tell me a tape. Well, that video is 10 minutes long, so don't look it up on YouTube. So why I say this is unfair is because what's basically happening is it's been a marker for young, because it's younger generation doing it. And it's been associated with basically younger women being less worthy of being taken seriously. And why should that be? Because when men do vocal fry, they are not criticised. And you have heard men doing vocal fry. You may not have thought about it much, but if you've watched any action movie, the star of the action movie will growl their way through the script. Here's Vin Diesel doing it.
What makes you so sure?
Because I'll be there to kick your ass.
Is that irritating? So there's a really interesting thing about prejudice that I could go into more. I wanted to get, I'm sort of conscious of time, Paul, don't worry, I have proper time. I want to just look at voices, future and AI. And I'm going to skip over a couple of bits, I won't have time, maybe do it in questions. But once we put voice onto a new species, artificial intelligence, it is going to change our reaction to devices. We suddenly will see devices like this Google Home as being more intelligent than they really are. Just look at this the Italian grandmother's response to this Google Home.
Hey, Google. Okay, Google.
So lots of things are going to happen around giving devices that we talk to in conversation and around giving voice to these devices. And I'm going to skip over one thing. I'm sorry to skip over one thing because I don't have time for it. I'm just going to talk about individualized speech synthesis. So this is a company, it's a spin out from Edinburgh University, who great Seacroft. And this is what we're going to get to the future with fake voices. Now this is not the best they can do, this is what they're prepared to publish online. This is a fake voice of someone famous, I don't need to say who it is, let's just play them. So to give you one sense of change that individualised speech synthesis is going to do to us. We've all probably lived through the era, most of us, maybe some maybe young, but I certainly have, where we've gone from photography being a true image to Photoshop, meaning large amounts of it can be faked. And first time you see an image on the internet, your first thought is that correct or not, before you sort of kind of try and evaluate it. We're going to go through the same learning process with voices. We're going to go from the point of which we assume when we hear a recording that it's likely to be true unless Rory Brummer is involved, to the point that it could well easily be faked. And you might have heard little glitches in that, but don't forget they could just say that's Donald Trump talking down a mobile phone line, and of course the mobile phone line is the cause of the glitches, not the synthesis. So we're going to see things like phishing scams using voice and all sorts coming down the line, unfortunately, and fake voices causing us lots of problems. So it's like all technologies, and I'm finishing, Paul. It's like all technologies, there's good points and bad points. And I'll just give you a good point, because individualised speech synthesis has got really good points. If you're unlucky and you suffer from a disease where you lose your voice, and this is an example of motor neuron disease, you don't all want to, when you end up using speech synthesis technology, you don't want to sound the same as everyone else. You don't want to sound like Stephen Hawking. So what Edinburgh University is working with MND is actually making individualised speech synthesis so MND sufferers can have a voice with the correct accent. And it's terribly important. And as Karen Pearce from the MND Association points out here, I can't imagine anything more important than being able to say to your wife, your husband or your children that you love them in your own voice. So not all technologies, there's good and bad in the future of AI and speaking, but it's certainly going to change our responses to voices. That's me done.